Hopefully the lighting isn't too horrendous here. I kind of just have to work with what I've got. It's a very makeshift setup, so apologies if the lighting isn't great. So we're here to talk about The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Joe Abercrombie is a British fantasy writer. This is his first book, released in 2006. I actually read this as part of an online reading group through the website Caravan, and that was with Murphy Napier's reading group. So I will put links for Caravan and for Murphy's channel in the description below. And you're welcome, Murphy, for the huge influx of subscribers you're about to receive. So The Blade Itself. This is the part of a book review where usually you'd get like a synopsis, a brief kind of plot hook, a little bit of a what is the book, what's it about. The thing with The Blade Itself is that summary essentially amounts to being, there are some people in the world, and then they kind of are in a place. They talk to each other sometimes, and yeah, that there's some fencing. So that maybe sounds like a criticism, but it's not. So right off the bat, like full spoiler-free response is, I liked the book and I think you should probably read it. I'm gonna try not to go into real specifics and any like big reveals or anything, but I'm also not going to be too careful necessarily with specifics when I talk about this. So if you're really sensitive to spoilers, maybe go away and read the book. And like I say, I do recommend it. Maybe go and read it before watching this video. So yeah, there's not a ton of plot, or I should say there's not a ton of action going on in this book. It is very much a character-driven story. It is essentially in being introduced to some characters, getting to know them, and kind of just following them as they go about elements of their lives, which I understand for some people might be a turn-off. I know a lot of people will especially read fantasy for more action, battles, all that kind of stuff. And that's not to say there isn't any action in this book. There is, and what is there I find to be done quite well. That was the post. But the focus is very clearly on the characters that you're spending time with. So it's a multiple POV story in third person. And there's a handful of people that you're getting perspectives from. And it kind of works most of the way through the book. It works on like a chapter by chapter basis. So you're getting sort of one character has a chapter here and then the next person has their own chapter. Towards the end of the book, as some of the characters come together, you are switching a little bit more quickly between them. So those three main characters that I spoke about that kind of get the most screen time, if you like, are Jazal, Logan, and Glokta. Most of the characters in general in this book sort of suck a bit, but you like them anyway. Except maybe Jazal, because he's a bit of an ass. So the first law is in the grimdark subgenre. And I think I'm not a huge fantasy reader, so I don't really have much kind of experience with various subgenres and trademarks and stuff like that. But as far as I understand it, this kind of idea of these morally grey characters who are not quite heroes, but they're not entirely villains and that kind of thing, that is very much a kind of mainstay of this genre. And I think if you're looking at it through that lens, Joe Abercrombie has basically just knocked it out of the park here. These characters are real. They feel like real people. And I think that is the key, because sometimes if you're trying to write these very morally grey characters, there can be a bit of a tendency to maybe just make them too awful for the sake of it being gritty and dark and adult and all that sort of stuff. But actually, Abercrombie hits a really nice balance where, as much as these aren't necessarily all good people, they do all feel like people. And that is incredibly important when you consider just how character-driven this book is. Someone on the reading group said something about how the three books, the trilogy, the First Law trilogy, was kind of written as one book and then sort of separated into volumes. And I definitely think that rings true, because this book really does feel like the first act of a larger story. You know, you're being introduced to the world and the characters, and it's a credit, I think, to how well Joe Abercrombie has put this together, that a book which does really feel like a lot of table setting in that way can be as compelling as it is. And a lot of that comes from the fact that actually this book is remarkably funny. You know, again, it kind of maybe belies its sort of more dark tone, which it does have. There is violence and there are moral complexities in there, but Abercrombie's prose is shot through with this dry wit throughout. You know, it's kind of acerbic, and it does make it genuinely funny. And I really appreciate that, because there's a sincerity to it there, and it isn't just dark and gritty for the sake of being dark and gritty. Those sections that are where violence does occur, or where people do say or do awful things, feel grounded in a world that it's not gratuitous. That violence isn't in there for gratuity's sake. And actually, it feels all the more impactful for the fact that Abercrombie's not just sort of throwing this dark, horrible stuff around all over the place. And then again, that applies to these characters who are multifaceted, three-dimensional people. He allows his characters to have more humane elements to them, and he kind of has these compassionate touches in there. And with the humor, the characters are often laughing at the situations that they're in, recognizing how sort of terrible they are and how doom and gloom everything is, and injecting that humor in there sort of just goes quite a long way to counteracting the darker elements. And I like that he's willing to explore both sides of things. So this would probably be a good time to get a bit more specific about the characters, I suppose. So you've got Giselle Dan Luther, who is a nobleman and a champion fencer. And immediately, like right off the bat, you basically hate this guy. He is really pompous and arrogant, and he's got this massive superiority complex. He is incredibly elitist. You kind of get the feeling he's never had to work for anything in his life. In fact, I think I think even on like the first page that you meet him, you learn that he is a captain in the King's Union, like the army, because his father basically bought him that position. So that's the kind of, you know, he's completely entitled. He's never been told no. He's just been able to buy his way into whatever he wants. And you feel that immediately, you know, you just don't like him at all. As the book goes on, I'd say he maybe gets a little bit more humanized. There's more layers to him, but I definitely still felt like he was a prick all the way through. But having said that, he's not, like I said, there are more layers added to him. He isn't a really two-dimensional character. You can actually understand why he is like that. He does feel like a real person. And then there is Logan Ninefingers, who is a barbarian from the north. And he is an interesting character because everything you see of him, he seems to be quite good in general. He's a bit crass, maybe a bit sort of uncouth, which you sort of maybe suspect is just a cultural difference between the capital in the south, which is Adua, and that's where we spend most of the book, and the north. Some of the ways that the sort of city dwellers talk about people from the north makes it seem like that is, you know, kind of their nature. But mostly he seems to be morally okay. He seems to be pretty much like a stand-up guy, you know, and tends to do the right thing and actually cares about other people. And yet he has this reputation of being the Bloody Nine, they call him. And there's these stories that surround him of just this brutal savagery. And it's quite difficult as you go through the book to really reconcile the character that you're spending time with and the character that you're getting to know and this reputation of this kind of really brutal savage. And I won't say any more about that because that's something which I think is really fun to discover on your own as you read it. And there is a scene later on in the novel, particularly memorable scene, which clarifies a lot of this. But actually, I think that ties in well with some of the themes that Abercrombie is exploring in the book. And you've got this idea of a hierarchical class system which exists in the capital city. And a hierarchical class system is something which isn't particularly new thing to explore in fantasy. Like I say, I'm not even much of a fantasy reader, but that seems like kind of an old idea and quite a mainstay in a lot of fantasy series. But I think the way Abercrombie approaches it is good. At one point in the book, a character says of the residents of the capital city that a man is born in his place and is expected to stay there. And that is something which you definitely see in the characters that Abercrombie has kind of highlighted. In Giselle Dan Luther, for example, he is a person that enjoys a spot at the very top of that society. He has everything that he wants, and he's celebrated and kind of led to this entitlement that he has. And we're kind of getting into mild spoilers now, but then when R.D. West arrives from the north, is that right? She's from the north, I think. When she arrives and he finds himself falling in love with her, he then actually laments the class system, which has up till now in his life been nothing but benefit to him, because he realizes that he can't be with the person that he wants because of these arbitrary rules getting in the way. And that definitely seems to be Abercrombie's kind of position on a lot of these ideas, is that they are arbitrary. And there's a lot of examples of people being in positions of influence or power within certain establishments and just being totally incompetent at their jobs. But because of who their family is, they are kind of entitled to that role. And so there's kind of an examination of birthright in there and how arbitrary and potentially ridiculous it can be. But you see this idea of people being sort of relegated or restricted to a certain role in society play out through Logan Ninefingers as well, despite the fact that he comes from North, which is a culture in which any person can rise to a place of prominence simply through being the strongest or whatever, because of the stories that get told about him. He's not even known as by his name. He's known as the Bloody Nine, and everywhere he goes, people seem to have heard of him. And he actually seems to carry quite a lot of shame about that reputation. And as I said before, you as a reader are struggling to reconcile the character of Logan Ninefingers with the reputation that he's managed to kind of cultivate. And it seems as though he is as well. He actually is struggling to reconcile those two elements of his personality, almost wondering how he could have done those things that he's known to have done. And what you find through spending time with these characters is that they're defined by just one or two facets of who they are, and that isn't actually who they are as a person. And that brings us on to Glocta. Now, I don't think I'm alone in saying that Glocta is my favourite character in this book, and one of the better characters I've read in a lot of books, to be honest. He is the most complex, I would say, of the characters that were given here. He's the most, I think, understandable, and to me at least, the most interesting. So Glocta is a bitter misanthrope. He has been through torture and it has left him almost completely crippled. From the sounds of things, one of his legs is just nasty, just all messed up. And so he lives in constant pain. He walks everywhere with a cane, and he's a bit misanthropic, a bit pessimistic. He always assumes everybody is lying, and he now works as an inquisitor, torturing people for information. And so he essentially become the thing that he probably hates the most. He the thing that actually kind of stripped him of who he once was is what he's become. And it has led to self-loathing, and he not only does he resent everybody else and the world around him, he kind of resents himself. And again, as we saw with Logan Ninefingers, there's a shame there about who he is and what he's doing. And it's also kind of important because who he used to be is basically Giselle Dan Luther. He was a champion fencer, and many still talk about how he was the best they've ever seen. He was a nobleman. He was at that position at the top of society. And now, maybe because he doesn't quite fit the mold of what people want, he's kind of just been cast aside, and he feels very much cast aside. But you can understand where his bitterness and his resentment come from. You know, he's a person that's been through extreme trauma. He has gone from holding a very privileged position in society to being essentially an outcast. He feels abandoned by a lot of people, and he uses his bitterness as kind of a defense mechanism. So I spent a long time talking about the characters, which is, I think, a fair reflection of what this book really is. And if you're going to enjoy it, I think it really is going to hinge on how well you connect with the characters. And I certainly plan to read the other books in the series, and the main motivation for me to do so is to jump back in and spend more time with those people that I feel like I've really got to know over the course of this book. But that isn't, you know, there is action stuff in the book. There are some action scenes, and I will say that they are, I think, handled really, really well. Abercrombie has quite a good ability to direct the kind of focus of the reader. Everything feels clear. You understand what's happening and to whom, and you can play the scene out quite clearly in your mind. It doesn't get cluttered, which I think is one of the dangers that you run into when you write action scenes. And so that's handled really well. And the prose in general, when you consider there's a lot of different perspectives going on here, and part of what helps bring the characters to life in the way that they do is that Abercrombie utilizes some kind of just slightly different prose styles for each different perspective character. So there is unity to the book. It doesn't feel really jarring to move from one to the other, but they're distinct enough that you always know where you are. And it means that later on in the novel, when some of the characters come together and you're switching between their kind of perspectives quite quickly, you might literally just be getting a paragraph with one character and then a paragraph from the perspective of another, sometimes even in the same room. So you're almost just quite literally just sort of jumping perspective across to someone else who's in the same scenario. But you can still track it all. It still totally tracks in your mind. You know exactly who you're dealing with, how they're feeling about things. And it's also really interesting when that starts happening, because you start to get this kind of cool thing that multiple perspectives allow, where you're seeing how hitting my microphone, sorry, where you start to see how the characters feel about each other and how two different characters feel about the same event. And that's really nice. And his ability to do that consistently and to juggle all of those different perspectives is really impressive. Now, that said, the prose and the style of the book is probably where my biggest complaints lie. The approach of having these different styles for each character is a really good one and a very smart one, and it's mostly done very well. But then you can run into the problem where you like the way one character is written better than another. For me personally, there's a character in the book, Pharaoh, who gets some perspective chapters, not quite as many as the kind of main three characters, but potentially she'll be a larger part of the sequels. And I just found the way that it was written infuriating. There was something about the cadence of that prose from her chapters that I just really couldn't get on board with. And there are these kind of little perfunctory statements that just reinforce the previous point that are put in there quite a lot. And if you look at my copy of the book, all in the margins of those sections, it's just me like screaming at the book, like, oh, that's so annoying, stop doing it. And once you've noticed, every time it happens just gets more and more annoying. That's obviously just a personal taste thing. And there are a few sort of stylistic complaints I'd have overall. There is kind of an over-reliance on adverbs and things like that, which is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Mostly though, it's written quite directly, quite clearly, and there isn't too much of a focus on long-winded, unnecessary descriptions of things. If something's being described, it tends to be relevant, and it also tends to be being described from the character's perspective, which again, there's some sort of quite subtle consistencies in there, certain things not being named the way they would be named by another character because you're in the perspective of someone who doesn't know what that is and is looking at it for the first time, that kind of thing. And that's all really commendable. Right, I think I've probably prattled on long enough now, haven't I? There's more that you could talk about. As with any book, I'm sure it could sustain sort of many hours of conversation, but that is not something I'm going to subject you to now. You'll be thankful to hear. I suppose the takeaway really is that this is a very strong character study with really well written three-dimensional characters. And despite not being a huge fantasy fan myself, not having much experience with the genre, and also aside from a few grievances that I have kind of stylistically with the prose, I ultimately really enjoyed it, and I absolutely plan to read the others as much as anything, just to kind of hang out with these characters again. So if that is something that you look for in a book, I'd absolutely recommend you pick up The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. But I'd love to know what you thought in the comments. So, leave a comment down below. And there's all sorts of buttons underneath this video. Just press them. You know how YouTube works. Click the buttons. I don't have an outro. You're on your own now. So bye.